In 1,850 seconds, Louisiana, one dance would shatter everything. When wealthy plantation heir Henry Ashford shocked his engagement party by waltzing with Ruth, a young enslaved girl in patched clothes, he had no idea he was about to uncover the most devastating secret his family had ever buried. What Ruth discovered hidden in his mother's wedding quilt would expose years of fraud, forgery, and a freedom that had been stolen for 3 long years. But as storm clouds gathered and dangerous men closed in, one ancient hymn held the key to survival and the power to transform public humiliation into the sweetest justice imaginable. The truth Ruth carried could destroy lives, expose corruption, and rewrite the rules of an entire community if she lived long enough to reveal it. If you're watching this incredible true story, subscribe and tell me what city you're from. I love connecting with viewers around the world. The kitchen air hung thick with herb steam at daybreak. Ruth sorted dried leaves by scent, her small fingers quick among the bundles. Sage for settling stomachs, mint for fever dreams, willow bark for the ache in old bones. "Keep humming, child," Aunt Scylla murmured from the cradle corner. "Baby's fever needs your steady tune." Ruth's voice rose soft and low, matching the rhythm of her breathing. The hymn came from deep memory verses her grandmother had sung while mending by lamplight. Jordan's banks, Jordan's bends. Each line held a picture: ferry poles in mist, safe doors by the river. Steam rose from the iron pot where biscuits waited. Ruth's humming wove under the clatter of tin cups and the creak of wagon boards outside. The baby's breath grew easier. Henry Ashford pushed through the kitchen door, boots scraping the pine floor. Ruth kept her eyes on the herbs, but she felt his gaze sweep the room. He was checking preparations for tonight's engagement supper. Tables to set, silver to polish. His betrothal to Lucille Vallaton would seal 2 fortunes. "All ready, Mr. Henry," Aunt Scylla said, not looking up from her mortar and pestle. "Ruth's got the herbs counted proper." Henry nodded. His mother had trusted Scylla's hands when fevers came. Now, 3 years after the yellow sickness took her, he still sought comfort in the kitchen's steady rhythms. The door swung wide again. Lucille entered like morning sun through silk curtains, bright, warming, impossible to ignore. Her blonde curls caught the lamplight. Her blue dress rustled with each step. "Oh, perfect," she said, surveying the kitchen. Her gaze moved over copper pots, clean wooden bowls, and the women working beside them. Everything looked so authentic. Ruth felt the attention settle on her patched dress. The blue calico had been mended many times, sleeves taken in, hem let down as she grew. But the patches were neat, and the color still held true. "Hold that pose," Lucille said lightly, tapping Ruth's sleeve with her fan. "I must show the ladies what passes for silk in your quarters." The herb steam seemed to cool. Ruth's humming faltered for just a heartbeat, then found its pitch again. The baby stirred but settled. Henry's jaw tightened. Something in Lucille's tone scraped against his memory. His mother's voice speaking softly about kindness being a choice you made each morning, like putting on clean clothes or saying your prayers. "Miss Lucille," Aunt Scylla said carefully, "Ruth's dress is honest work, clean and mended proper." "Oh, I'm sure it is." Lucille's smile stayed bright. "It's just so imaginative. All those little patches trying to look like one whole piece." Ruth kept sorting herbs, chamomile for calming, feverfew for headaches. Her humming never stopped, but now it carried something else, a thread of steel wrapped in velvet. The kitchen door banged open. Pike, the overseer, filled the doorframe. His presence changed the air like a storm cloud moving across the sun. "Mr. Henry," Pike said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "your daddy wants to see the arrangements. Guests arriving at 4. Henry glanced once more at Ruth, noting how her patched sleeve caught the morning light. The blue calico reminded him of something, a fragment of memory just out of reach. "We'll be ready," he said. Lucille swept toward the door, her skirts brushing Ruth's elbow. "Come along, Henry. Let's see what other authentic touches we can find for tonight." As their footsteps faded, Ruth continued her humming. The baby slept peaceful now. The herbs lay sorted in neat piles. But something had shifted in the kitchen's careful order. "That one's got eyes like winter," Aunt Scylla muttered, grinding bark to powder. "Sees everything, understands nothing." Ruth nodded but kept her voice low and steady. "Jordan's banks, Jordan's bends." The hymn knew where it was going, even when the path stayed hidden. Outside, wheels creaked on the dirt road. Guests would arrive by evening, men with clean hands and loud voices, women with silk fans and sharp smiles. They would eat from the good china and talk about cotton prices and river trade. But here in the kitchen, steam still rose from honest work. Herbs waited to heal, and a small girl's humming held the morning together, one note at a time. The sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that clung to the bayou. Soon the house would fill with laughter and music. Ruth would serve from the good silver, her patched dress moving quiet as a prayer among the guests. She did not know yet that before the night ended, those patches would become the center of all attention. That her dress mocked as pretend finery would remind one man of love and loss and the choice between cruelty and mercy. For now, she hummed and worked and kept the kitchen's peace. The herbs knew their purpose. The baby breathed easy, and somewhere in the back of her memory, verses stirred like maps drawn in song, waiting for the moment when their hidden roots would matter most. The morning stretched long and golden, holding all possibilities in its light. By midday, the plantation buzzed with preparation. In the yard behind the kitchen, tables appeared under the spreading oak. White cloths snapped in the breeze. Crystal glasses caught the sun like captured rainbows. Lucille held court among the visiting ladies, directing the placement of chairs and flowers. Her voice carried clearly across the yard, bright as birdsong. "Now, I want everything perfect for our announcement," she said, adjusting a centerpiece of white roses. "Henry's been so particular about every detail. It's quite touching, really." The ladies murmured approval. Mrs. Boudreau fanned herself against the growing heat. Miss Celeste dabbed her neck with a lace handkerchief. They had come from New Orleans and Baton Rouge to witness the joining of two fine families. Ruth moved between the tables, setting silver forks with careful precision. Each piece had to align just so, the way Aunt Scylla had taught her. The good silver had belonged to Henry's mother, heavy pieces, with rose patterns etched in the handles. "You there, girl?" Lucille called sweetly. "Come stand in the light so my friends can see you properly." Ruth paused, a handful of spoons still unplaced. The ladies turned their attention toward her, fans fluttering like butterfly wings. "Look at that dress," Miss Celeste said with a small laugh. "How creative." Ruth stood still as Lucille circled her slowly, as if inspecting a horse at market. The patched blue calico had been washed and pressed for the occasion. Each mended place showed careful stitching, Ruth's own handiwork, done by lamplight. "It's really quite remarkable," Lucille continued, her voice carrying that same bright tone. "All those little pieces trying so hard to match, like what would you call it? A crazy quilt?" The ladies tittered behind their fans. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her breathing steady. She began humming under her breath, just a whisper of melody that no one else could hear. "Mrs. Boudreau leaned forward with interest. "Where did she find such fabric? It looks almost like—" "Scraps," Lucille finished smoothly. "From the rag bin, I imagine. But you must admire the optimism. All those patches pretending to be one whole piece of cloth." Ruth's humming found its true pitch, the note that had calmed the baby that morning, the tone that seemed to steady everything around it. She thought of her grandmother's hands guiding hers through her first stitches, showing her how to make something broken whole again. "The child's got a voice," Miss Celeste observed. "Listen to that tune." "Oh, yes," Lucille said, her smile sharp as a blade. "She's always singing something. Aren't you, dear?" Such enthusiasm. From the kitchen door, Henry emerged carrying a tray of glasses. He had changed from his work clothes into a dark suit that made his shoulders look broader. His hair was combed back, but one strand fell across his forehead in the heat. He paused when he saw the tableau, Ruth standing surrounded by the ladies, their attention fixed on her patched dress like cats watching a cornered mouse. Something about the scene struck him wrong. The way Lucille's smile never reached her eyes, the way the other ladies leaned forward with hungry interest, the way Ruth stood perfectly still, her small hands folded, her humming the only sound that seemed real in all the bright chatter. "Henry," Lucille called, her voice lifting with delight. "Perfect timing. Come settle a debate for us. Don't you think our little singer here looks positively festive?" Henry set down the tray and approached slowly. Up close, he could see the quality of Ruth's mending tiny. even stitches that spoke of skill and patience. The blue calico was faded but clean, pressed smooth as any fine lady's dress, and then memory struck him like lightning. That particular shade of blue, that same small pattern of flowers and vines, he had seen it before, in the quilt that covered his mother's bed during her last illness. Strips of blue calico had been pieced into the binding, remnants from a dress she had worn as a young bride. The memory hit him so hard he almost staggered, his mother's gentle hands smoothing that quilt, her voice, weak with fever but still kind, telling him to remember that every person carried a piece of God's image, no matter what clothes they wore or work they did. "Henry?" Lucille's voice seemed to come from far away. "You look quite pale. Are you well?" He stared at Ruth's dress, seeing past the patches to the careful work beneath. Each mended place was a small act of hope, someone believing this cloth deserved to be made whole again. "It's lovely," he said quietly. The word fell into the group like a stone into still water. The ladies' fans stopped fluttering. Lucille's bright smile flickered. "Lovely?" Mrs. Boudreau repeated, as if she might have misheard. "The workmanship?" Henry continued, his voice growing stronger. "Every stitch placed with care. It reminds me of—" He stopped. The memory was too precious to share with these women who had gathered to mock a child's clothes. Lucille laughed, the sound like glass breaking on stone. "Oh, Henry, your mother did always say you had too soft a heart for your own good." The mention of his mother in that careless tone made something snap inside his chest. He looked at Ruth, really looked at her, and saw not a slave child in patched clothes, but a person, standing with quiet dignity while adults made sport of her appearance. "Excuse me," he said, and walked back toward the house. Behind him, he heard Lucille's voice rise in explanation to her friends, something about the heat affecting men's judgment. But her words seemed to come from another world. In the kitchen doorway, he paused and turned back. Ruth was finishing with the silver now, moving from table to table with practiced grace. Her humming had returned, steady as a heartbeat, holding the whole scene together. The blue calico caught the afternoon light, and for a moment, Henry could almost see his mother's quilt spread across the garden, could almost hear her voice saying that kindness was always a choice, always available, always needed most when it was hardest to give. Tonight, when the guests arrived, and the music played, and the engagement was announced, he would remember this moment. He would remember Ruth's dignity in the face of cruelty. He would remember his mother's teachings about the image of God in every face, and he would have to choose what kind of man to become. The sun burned high overhead, casting short shadows on the white tablecloths. Soon, the real guests would arrive, men with loud voices and strong opinions about property and propriety. The evening would unfold according to plan, with toasts and dancing and the formal announcement of his betrothal. But something had already changed in that moment of recognition, that flash of memory triggered by blue calico and careful stitches. A choice was taking shape in Henry's heart, as real and solid as the silver on the tables, as certain as the hymn that continued to rise from Ruth's throat like a prayer made audible. The afternoon stretched toward evening, heavy with possibility and the weight of decisions not yet made. As dusk painted the sky purple and gold, carriages rolled up the oak-lined drive. Lanterns bobbed from the porch posts, casting warm circles of light across the yard. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of fiddle music. Henry stood in the parlor, adjusting his collar for the third time. Through the tall windows, he could see guests gathering on the lawn, men in dark suits, smoking cigars, women in silk gowns that rustled like autumn leaves. "You look handsome, son," his father said, clapping a heavy hand on Henry's shoulder. "Tonight's the night we've been planning for. The Valletons bring good money and better connections." Henry nodded but said nothing. His thoughts kept returning to that moment in the garden, the way Ruth had stood so still, while the ladies circled her like vultures, the careful stitches in her dress, the dignity in her silence. Outside, more carriages arrived. Wheels crunched on gravel. Voices called greetings across the warm evening air. The gathering was growing, filling with the kind of people who mattered in their world: plantation owners, merchants, politicians, wives. "Time to make your entrance," his father said, straightening his own vest. "Lucille's waiting on the porch. Looks like an angel in that white dress." Henry followed his father outside, stepping into the golden lantern light. Lucille did indeed look angelic, her blonde hair pinned with white roses, her silk gown catching the lamplight like captured moonbeams. She extended her hand with a practiced smile. "There's my handsome groom," she said sweetly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind." Henry kissed her gloved hand as expected. The guests applauded lightly, wine glasses glinting in the soft light. Someone called out a toast to the happy couple, but Henry's attention was caught by movement near the kitchen door. Ruth emerged carrying a silver tray, her patched dress somehow dignified despite, or perhaps because of the contrast with the silk and satin around her. She moved between the guests like a shadow, refilling glasses, offering small cakes from the good china. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lucille's father called out, his voice carrying across the yard, "if I may have your attention, we're gathered tonight to celebrate a most happy announcement." The crowd turned toward the speaker, conversations fading to an expectant murmur. Henry felt Lucille's hand tighten on his arm, anchoring him to his expected role. "The engagement of my beloved daughter, Lucille, to Mr. Henry Ashford," the elder Valerton continued. "Two families joined, two fortunes united, two hearts made one." Applause rippled through the gathering. Someone struck up a waltz on the fiddle, and couples began to form on the grass that had been smoothed for dancing. It was then that Lucille's sharp voice cut through the music. "Oh, everyone must see our little singer again," she called out, gesturing toward Ruth, who stood frozen near the edge of the dancing area. "She was such entertainment this afternoon. Come here, dear." Henry felt his stomach drop. Ruth approached slowly, her tray balanced perfectly despite the attention of 30 pairs of eyes. "Just look at that dress again," Lucille continued, her voice bright as broken glass. "Those precious little patches, all trying so hard to match. Isn't it the most creative thing you've ever seen?" A few guests chuckled. Others shifted uncomfortably. Ruth stood perfectly still, her breathing steady, her humming just audible under the fiddle music. "It's like a child playing dress-up." Lucille pressed on, emboldened by the attention. All those scraps sewn together, pretending to be something fine. Such imagination. Henry watched Ruth's face calm, dignified, unbroken despite the cruelty of adult laughter. He thought of his mother's quilt, of careful hands stitching broken pieces into something beautiful and whole. And suddenly he could not bear it. "You're right," he said, his voice cutting through the laughter. "It is like something fine." The crowd's attention shifted to him. Lucille's smile faltered slightly. "Those patches," Henry continued, stepping away from his fiancée's side, "represent hours of careful work. Someone took broken pieces and made them whole again. That's not pretense, that's hope." He walked across the grass toward Ruth, who watched him approach with wide, steady eyes. "It reminds me," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the yard, "of my mother's wedding quilt. She used to say that the most beautiful things are often made from pieces others might throw away." He stopped in front of Ruth and offered a formal bow, as if she wore silk instead of patches. "Would you honor me with a dance?" The question hung in the evening air like a challenge. Conversation stopped. The fiddle wavered and went silent. 30 guests stared in complete shock as Henry Ashford, heir to one of the finest plantations in Louisiana, extended his hand to a small enslaved girl in a patched dress. Ruth looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the lantern light. For a moment that felt like eternity, no one moved, no one breathed. Then Ruth placed her small hand in Henry's larger one and curtsied with the grace of any lady at a ball. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I would be honored." Henry nodded to the fiddle player, who, after a moment's hesitation, began a gentle waltz. And there, on the grass where she had been mocked just moments before, Henry Ashford danced with Ruth as if she were the most important person at the gathering. They moved slowly, carefully, Henry matching his steps to hers. Ruth's humming rose to meet the fiddle music, her perfect pitch lifting the simple melody into something transcendent. The guests stood frozen in tableau, some scandalized, some moved, all witness to a moment that would reshape everything they thought they knew about propriety and worth. Lucille's face had gone white as her dress. Pike, the overseer, pushed forward through the crowd, his hand moving toward the whip at his belt. But Henry's father raised a warning hand, unsure whether to intervene or let the scandal unfold. As the music ended, Henry bowed once more to Ruth, who curtsied in return. The lantern light caught the blue calico of her dress, transforming the patches into something that looked almost like flowers scattered across water. "Thank you," Henry said softly, his words meant for Ruth, but carrying to the entire gathering. "That was the most honest dance I've ever shared." Ruth smiled, the first true smile Henry had seen from her all day. "Thank you, Mr. Henry," she whispered, "for seeing the whole instead of just the pieces." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of night birds calling from the bayou. 30 guests tried to process what they had witnessed, a moment that violated every rule they knew about who mattered and who didn't, who deserved kindness and who could be safely ignored. And in that moment of shocked silence, something shifted in the evening air. A choice had been made visible, a line had been drawn, and everyone present knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The fiddle player tentatively began another tune, but no one moved. To dance. The party continued, but the easy laughter had fled. And somewhere in the gathering dusk, the first whispers began words that would travel from plantation to plantation, carrying the story of a dance that changed everything. The last carriage rolled away near midnight, wheels crunching on gravel still damp with evening mist. Henry stood on the porch watching red lanterns disappear down the oak-lined drive. Behind him, the house creaked with the settling sounds of a night after storm. The storm had been more than social. Lucille had waited until the guests departed before unleashing her fury in the parlor, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Dance with property?" she had hissed, white silk rustling with each angry gesture. "In front of the Boudreaux? The Celestes? Do you know what story they'll carry back to New Orleans?" Henry's father had paced the carpet, his heavy boots wearing a path between the fireplace and the windows. "Son, what possessed you? That child, she's worth good money, but she's not." "Not what?" Henry had asked quietly. "Not worthy of such attention." The words had hung in the air like smoke. Henry thought of Ruth's careful stitches, her dignity under mockery, the way her humming had steadied everything around her. "Perhaps," he had said, "we've been measuring worth with the wrong scales." Now, alone on the porch, he heard footsteps approach from the direction of the quarters. Ruth appeared in the lamplight, carrying a basket of herbs and a small tin cup. "Mr. Henry," she said softly, "Aunt Scylla sent feverfew tea, said you might need steadying after such a night." Henry accepted the cup gratefully. The tea was bitter but warming, carrying the comfort of Scylla's careful preparation. "That was brave tonight," Ruth said, settling onto the porch steps. "Dangerous, too." Henry sat beside her. "Propriety be damned." "My mother would have done the same," Ruth nodded. "Aunt Scylla remembers your mama. Said she had hands that could gentle any fever, voice that could calm any storm." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to night sounds from the bayou owls calling, branches creaking, the distant splash of something moving through dark water. "Ruth," Henry said finally, "that hymn you're always humming, where did you learn it?" Her voice came soft as moth wings. "From my grandmama, before she passed. Said it was older than old, came from the crossing time, when folks needed songs to remember the way home. Would you teach it to me?" Ruth glanced at him with surprise, then began to hum. The melody rose and fell like water over stones, each phrase carrying weight and memory. "Jordan's banks, Jordan's bends," she sang quietly. "Follow the star through the cypress knees. 3 poles mark the turning place, where the safe door opens east." Henry listened carefully. "It sounds like directions. Grandmama said songs could carry more than music. Said sometimes they carried maps." A new sound interrupted horses' hooves on the road, moving fast through the night. Henry rose, peering into the darkness beyond the lantern light. Pike emerged from the shadows, leading a small group of men on horseback. Their faces were hard in the lamplight, their voices low but urgent. "Mr. Henry," Pike called out. "Need a word, private-like." Ruth was already moving, gathering her basket and cup, but Henry caught her arm gently. "Stay," he said quietly. "Whatever this is about, you should hear it." Pike's jaw tightened, but he approached the porch. The men behind him remained mounted, hands resting on pistol butts. "Got word from town," Pike said. Judge Harlan's called for papers tomorrow. Wants to see all bills of sale, all transfers made in the last month. Henry felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of papers? The kind that prove ownership. The kind that show who belongs where and to whom. Pike's eyes flicked toward Ruth. Especially for any property that's been drawing unusual attention. Ruth had gone very still beside Henry, but her breathing remained steady. Under her breath, so quietly only Henry could hear, she began to hum again. "There's been talk," one of the mounted men said, "about your behavior tonight. Some folks think maybe the girl's gotten above her station. Needs relocating before she causes more trouble." Henry's hand moved protectively toward Ruth's shoulder. "By whose authority?" Pike smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "By the authority of men who understand property values. Men who know that one bad example can spoil a whole batch." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, the wax seal dark red in the lantern light. "Got a bill of sale here. All legal and proper. Buyers waiting downriver, good Christian folks who know how to handle troublesome property." Henry took the paper with hands that didn't quite shake. The seal looked official enough, but something about it seemed wrong. The wax was too bright, the color more carmine than the oxblood he remembered from legal documents. "This is dated today," he said, studying the writing. "How can you sell what you don't own?" Pike's smile widened. "Your daddy signed the transfer yesterday." Before the unfortunate events of this evening, Ruth's humming stopped abruptly. She leaned forward, squinting at the paper in the lamplight. "Mr. Henry," she whispered, "look at the clerk's mark on the seal. The letter's all wrong." Henry peered closer at the wax impression. There was indeed something off about the letter forms. The serif on what should have been a D curved the wrong direction. "Clerk Dupre's been marking papers for 20 years, Ruth continued, her voice barely audible. "His letters lean left, not right. And his wax is always dark, dark as dried blood." Pike snatched the paper back. "Enough chatter. Girl needs to come along now, before this gets more complicated." Henry stood slowly, his mind racing. Ruth's observation about the clerk's seal, combined with his own uneasiness about the timing, suggested something deeply wrong. "I'll need to verify this with Judge Harlan myself," he said. "No time for that," Pike replied. "Buyers are waiting at the river landing. Boat leaves with the morning tide." But as Pike spoke, Ruth had begun humming again, a different verse this time, one that seemed to map a path through the night. "Follow the star through the cypress knees," she sang softly. "3 poles mark the turning place, where the safe door opens east." Henry caught her meaning. She was telling him something about roots, about places of refuge in the darkness beyond Pike's authority. "Ruth," Henry said clearly, "go help Aunt Scylla with the medicine stores. I believe someone may be taking ill soon." It was code, simple and direct. Ruth rose smoothly, gathered her basket, and disappeared into the house. But Henry heard her voice continue from the shadows, humming directions into the night. Pike cursed and gestured to his men. "Find the girl. Bring her back." But as they dismounted and moved toward the house, a new sound rose from the bayou, deep and rumbling like distant thunder. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally arriving, bringing wind and rain that would make river travel treacherous. Henry smiled grimly. "Seems the weather has other plans for your buyers, Pike. Boats don't run in storms like this." Lightning flashed on the horizon, illuminating dark clouds rolling in from the Gulf. The air pressure was dropping, making everyone's ears pop. "We'll wait it out," Pike said stubbornly. "Will you?" Henry asked. "And risk losing your property to flood or lightning? Seems like poor business sense." As if summoned by his words, the first fat raindrops began to fall, hissing against the lantern glass. Pike gathered his men with visible frustration. "This isn't over, boy. Papers are papers. Sale's been made." They mounted and rode off into the gathering storm, but Henry knew they would be back. The question was whether he and Ruth could find answers before Pike returned with more men and fewer scruples. He looked up at the dark windows of the house, where Ruth was surely watching from some hidden vantage point. The hymn she had taught him ran through his head like a lifeline, directions to safe places, routes through the darkness, maps hidden in melody. Thunder rolled across the bayou, and the rain began in earnest. By morning, the dirt roads would be rivers of mud, making travel slow and treacherous. But storms also washed away tracks and muffled sounds, creating opportunities for those brave enough to move through the darkness. Henry pulled his collar up against the rain and headed for the stable. If Pike's papers were forged, then somewhere in the night there had to be proof. And if Ruth's hymn truly was a map, then perhaps it could guide them to the answers they needed. The storm was a gift, chaotic, dangerous, but ultimately cleansing. In its fury, old certainties would wash away, and new possibilities would emerge from the muddy aftermath. Behind him, the house stood dark and solid against the wind, but from one upstairs window, a single candle flickered Ruth's signal that she was ready for whatever came next. The dance was over. Now, the real work began. Rain drummed against the kitchen windows as Aunt Scylla packed herbs into a worn leather satchel. Her hands moved with the efficiency of long practice, willow bark for pain, feverfew for headaches, digitalis for hearts that struggled to keep rhythm. Storms getting worse, Ruth observed from her station by the fire. She was grinding dried roots with steady motions, the mortar singing against the pestle. Roads'll be pure mud by morning. Good, Scylla muttered. Mud slows down men with bad intentions. Through the kitchen door came Henry, water streaming from his coat. He had spent the last hour in the stable, checking supplies and thinking through possibilities. The storm provided cover, but it also created new dangers. Any word from Pike? Scylla asked without looking up from her packing. Gone for now, but he'll be back. Henry shook rain from his hair and moved toward the fire. Ruth, that hymn your grandmother taught you, you said it carried directions. Ruth nodded, her grinding never pausing. 3 verses I know by heart. Each one maps a different path through the bayou country. To where? Safe places, hidden doors, folks who help when help is needed. Scylla finally looked up from her work. Mr. Henry, you understanding what you're asking? Following those paths means stepping outside the law as most folk know it. Henry thought of Pike's forged paper, of the wrongness in the wax seal, of Ruth's dignity under cruel laughter. Maybe it's time to step outside laws that protect cruelty and call it righteousness. Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the windows. Ruth set down her pestle and moved to the back door, peering out into the storm. River's rising fast, she reported. Ferry'll be running high and dangerous. But there's another way the old pirogue route through the cypress swamp. Takes longer, but it's protected from the main current. Can you find it in this weather? Ruth smiled for the first time since Pike's visit. Grandmama used to say a good hymn could guide you through any storm. Just have to listen for the right notes. Scylla secured the last of her herb bundles and shouldered the satchel. Then we best get moving before the roads wash out completely. Missus. Ellery lives 2 hours through the swamp. She's Quaker folk, believes in helping those who need sanctuary. Henry pulled on his coat again, already damp from his earlier trip to the stable. What about documentation? If Pike's paper is forged, we need proof. Mrs. Ellery's got connections with Clark Dupre, Scylla said. Her late husband used to help with record-keeping before the fever took him. She might know something about genuine seals versus false ones. They gathered their supplies in silence, food, dry clothes, lanterns, and the precious herbs that might buy them welcome in strange places. Ruth wrapped her few possessions in a square of oiled cloth, including the small ribbon that had belonged to her grandmother. One more thing, Henry said, as they prepared to leave. That hymn I need to learn all the verses. If we get separated, I want to be able to follow the same map. Ruth taught him as they walked, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of their steps through the muddy yard. The melody seemed to echo the landscape around them, rising like hills, dropping like valleys, turning like the river bends they would need to navigate. Jordan's banks, Jordan's bends, follow the star through the cypress knees. 3 poles mark the turning place, where the safe door opens east. By the 3rd repetition, Henry had caught the tune. By the 5th, he could sing it with confidence. The words seemed to paint pictures in his mind, specific landmarks, recognizable patterns that would hold true even in darkness. They reached the edge of the swamp just as the full fury of the storm arrived. Wind howled through the cypress trees, bending their ancient trunks like grass. Rain fell in sheets, turning the world into a study in grey and black. Ruth led them to a hidden pirogue, its hull blackened with age but still sound. She tested the balance with practiced skill, then gestured for the others to climb aboard. Stay low, she instructed. Storm makes the trees drop branches without warning. They pushed off into dark water that reflected lightning like broken mirrors. Ruth navigated by feel and instinct, her small hands guiding them between submerged logs and around the massive cypress knees that rose from the water like cathedral pillars. The hymn continued under her breath, each verse revealing new information about their route. Henry began to understand that the song was indeed a map-coded directions that could be passed from one generation to the next without ever being written down. "Second verse now," Ruth murmured, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Mockingbird calls from the hollow oak, 3 heartbeats east of the standing stone. Follow the white sand to the split-rail gate, where mercy keeps a lantern bright." As if summoned by the song, a mockingbird's call echoed through the rain. Ruth adjusted their course slightly, aiming for a massive oak that stood hollow and ancient on a small rise of land. Beyond the oak, Henry spotted the standing stone, a granite marker left by some long-dead surveyor, and there, barely visible through the rain, a line of white sand marking higher ground. The hymn was working. The map was true. They pulled the pirogue up onto a muddy bank and followed a barely visible trail through the trees. Ruth's lantern swung ahead of them, casting wild shadows that danced with each lightning flash. "There," Scylla said softly, pointing through the trees. "Mrs. Ellery's place." A small cabin sat in a clearing, its windows glowing with steady lamplight. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the rain, and a covered porch offered shelter from the storm. As they approached, the front door opened. A woman appeared in the lamplight, middle-aged, grey-haired, wearing a simple dress and an expression of watchful kindness. "Scylla?" she called into the rain. "That, you bringing company on such a night?" "It's me, Mary," Scylla called back. "Got folks need sanctuary and answers both." "Mrs.?" Ellery gestured them onto the porch, her gaze taking in their muddy clothes and worried faces. "Come in, all of you. Storm's no place for Christian souls to wander." They entered a warm kitchen that smelled of bread and safety. "Mrs." Ellery moved efficiently, setting out towels and hot tea, asking no questions about why they had traveled through a dangerous storm to reach her door. "Now then," she said when they were dried and warmed, "what answers are you seeking on such a wild night?" Henry produced the paper Pike had shown him, now somewhat damp from their journey. "This claims to be a legal bill of sale, but something about the seal seems wrong. Mrs." Ellery examined the document carefully, holding it close to the lamplight. Her expression grew troubled as she studied the wax impression. "This is not Robert Dupre's work," she said finally. "The letter forms are all wrong backward serifs, wrong pressure, false color. Robert uses oxblood wax, dark as old wine. This is bright carmine, the kind merchants use for shipping manifests. So, it's forged? Completely. And poorly done, too, as if whoever made it had never seen Robert's genuine seals." She set the paper aside with disgust. "Someone's trying to move people illegally." "The question is why?" Ruth spoke up from her place by the fire. "Pike's been talking about debt, says the plantation owes more than it's worth. Maybe he's planning to sell folks off before anyone can stop him." "Missus." Ellery nodded grimly. "Debt makes men desperate, and desperate men do terrible things to protect their fortunes. Is there legal remedy?" Henry asked. "Some way to prove the forgery and stop the sale. Robert Dupre would know his own work. But reaching him means getting to the courthouse in town, and that means traveling roads that Pike controls." Ruth looked up from her teacup. "Not necessarily. The hymn has a third verse. Maps a route that avoids the main roads entirely." She began to sing softly, her voice weaving new directions through the storm. "River turns where willows weep, past the church with the broken bell. 7 steps to the hidden door, where true records sleep in oak and brass." Henry felt hope stir in his chest. "A back way to the courthouse." "To the old records office," Ruth clarified, "where copies of all papers are kept. If we can prove Pike's document is false, maybe we can find the real papers that show who belongs where." Mrs. Ellery refilled their cups, her movements thoughtful. "It's dangerous work you're contemplating. Pike has friends in town, men who profit from his schemes. If you're caught—" "If we do nothing," Henry said quietly, "Ruth and her mother will disappear downriver. Others too, most likely. Pike's fear makes him reckless, and reckless men leave wide trails of destruction." The wind howled around the cabin. but inside the lamplight held steady. Ruth continued humming her grandmother's hymn, each verse a promise that safe paths existed for those brave enough to follow them. Outside, the storm raged with primal fury. But inside, hope was taking root, fragile as a seedling, but growing stronger with each note of the ancient song that carried maps to freedom written in melody and memory. The night was far from over, and the real danger still lay ahead. But for the first time since Pike's visit, Henry believed that truth might prove stronger than forged papers and false seals. The hymn knew the way. They just had to have faith enough to follow. Dawn came grey and muted through the storm clouds, revealing a world transformed by wind and rain. Trees lay across roads like fallen giants. Creeks had become rivers, and rivers had become lakes that stretched to new horizons. Henry woke to the smell of biscuits and coffee, his body stiff from sleeping on Mrs. Ellery's kitchen floor. Ruth sat by the window, watching water drip from the eaves in steady rhythm. Her humming had continued even in sleep, as if the hymn was too important to silence. "Storm's breaking, Mrs. Ellery announced from the hearth. "But the roads'll be treacherous for days. Pike won't be moving anyone far in this weather." Scylla emerged from the back room where she had tended Mrs. Ellery's arthritic joints through the night. "Mary's right about the roads, but that might work in our favor. Pike's stuck just like we are." Henry accepted a cup of coffee gratefully, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. How long to reach the records office, using Ruth's route? "Half a day through the swamp," Ruth replied. "But the going's slow with all this rain. Water's up in places it's never been before." Mrs. Ellery handed out cornbread still warm from the oven. "There's another consideration. My neighbor, Thomas Bray, rode in before the worst of the storm. Says Pike's been asking questions about hidden routes and old maps. Someone's told him the locals know ways around the main roads." Henry felt his stomach tighten. Does he know about the hymn? Not specifically, but he knows something exists, some system folks use to move through the country without using his roads. Ruth stood and began packing her few belongings. "Then, we can't wait. Every hour gives Pike more time to figure out our plans. The water's dangerous," Scylla warned. "Currents running, fast, and full of debris. One wrong turn could dump you in the main channel." "Grandmama always said the hymn would hold true even in flood," Ruth replied quietly. "The landmarks don't change, they just get harder to see." Henry finished his coffee and gathered his own gear. Mrs. Ellery pressed a packet of food into his hands along with a small leather pouch. "Dried corn and jerked meat," she explained. "And this?" She opened the pouch to reveal several official-looking seals and a stick of dark wax. "Robert Dupré left these with my husband years ago when they worked together on county surveys. Genuine seals, genuine wax. If you need to prove what true documents look like, these will serve." Henry stared at the precious items. "You're trusting us with evidence that could get you hanged?" Mrs. Ellery smiled sadly. "My husband used to say that some truths are too important to hide, even when revealing them brings danger. These seals have been waiting for the right moment to speak their testimony. They made their final preparations in the grey morning light. The pirogue had survived the storm undamaged, riding high against the tree where they had secured it. But the swamp around them had transformed into something alien and threatening. What had been firm ground the night before now lay under 3 feet of muddy water. Trees that had marked clear paths were now partially submerged, their lower branches creating snares for unwary travelers. "Stay close," Ruth instructed as they pushed off into the current. "Water's got its own voice now, different from the normal songs. Got to listen careful to know which way it wants to carry us." She began the 3rd verse of her hymn, the one that mapped the path to the records office. "River turns where willows weep, past the church with the broken bell, 7 steps to the hidden door, where true records sleep in oak and brass." But the familiar landmarks looked different in flood conditions. The weeping willows stood knee-deep in dark water. The church with the broken bell was barely visible above the swollen creek that surrounded it. Ruth guided them with steady skill, reading the new landscape like text written in water and wood. She found channels where none seemed to exist, navigated around debris fields that could have trapped them for hours. "There," she said softly, pointing through the rain. "The church bell. Still broken, still ringing false when the wind catches it right." The sound carried across the water a cracked, mournful note that seemed to mourn the storm's destruction. Beyond the church, Henry could make out buildings that marked the edge of town. 7 steps to the hidden door, Ruth continued, counting off landmarks, invisible to Henry's eyes. Rope bridge, standing stone, lightning split oak, 3 graves with iron crosses, the miller's wheel, the old well, and there the courthouse backstairs. Each marker appeared as she named it, though some required faith to recognize under their coating of storm debris and floodwater. They beached the pirogue behind a screen of fallen branches and waded the last 100 yards through knee-deep water. The courthouse stood on higher ground, its brick walls dark with rain but still solid against the storm. Ruth led them to a narrow door tucked beneath a flight of external stairs. The wood was swollen with moisture, but Henry's shoulder forced it open with a groan of protest. Inside, the records office smelled of old paper and ink, leather and brass fittings. Rows of shelves stretched back into darkness, each laden with bound volumes that chronicled decades of legal transactions. "Robert keeps the seal records here," Mrs. Ellery had told them. "Third shelf from the back, red leather binding. Every impression he's ever made, catalogued by date and document type." Ruth found the volume with the efficiency of someone who had learned to locate important things quickly. She opened it to pages dating from the current year, running her finger down columns of meticulous notes. "Here," she said, "Pike's been using official seals, but look at the dates. Every genuine document shows Robert's careful notes, pressure applied, wax temperature, drying time. The forged paper has none of these details." Henry studied the entries, comparing them to Pike's document. The differences were clear once you knew what to look for. Genuine work showed the clerk's careful attention to process, while the forgery lacked the small details that marked authentic craftsmanship. "But we need more than this," Henry said. "We need proof of Pike's illegal sales, evidence that he's been moving people without proper documentation." Ruth had moved to another shelf, pulling down a ledger marked "Bills of Sale, Personal Property." She opened it carefully, scanning pages of handwritten entries. "Mr. Henry," she said quietly, "look at this." The ledger showed a disturbing pattern. Over the past 6 months, Pike had recorded sales of more than 30 people, men, women, children sold to buyers downriver. But when Henry compared the dates to his father's business records, most of the sales had occurred when the elder Ashford was away on travel. "He's been selling people without authorization," Henry realized, "using forged papers to make it look legal. And pocketing the money," Ruth added, pointing to discrepancies in the recorded prices. "These amounts are twice what he's been reporting to your father." They copied the relevant information quickly, Ruth's neat handwriting preserving the evidence of Pike's fraud. As they worked, the sound of horses' hooves echoed from the street outside. "Time to go," Scylla whispered from her post by the window. "Riders coming, and they don't look friendly." They gathered their evidence and slipped out the back door as voices rose from the courthouse steps. Pike had arrived with reinforcements, but the storm had bought them just enough time. The return journey through the swamp tested all of Ruth's skill. The water was higher now, the current stronger, the familiar paths harder to read. But her grandmother's hymn held true, guiding them between danger and safety with notes that seemed to anticipate every hazard. As they reached Mrs. Ellery's cabin, the sun finally broke through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light across the floodwaters. The storm was ending, and with it, their window of protection. But they had what they needed, proof of Pike's crimes, evidence that would stand in any honest court. The question now was whether they could present their case before Pike silenced them forever. Inside the warm kitchen, Mrs. Ellery helped them spread their findings on the table. The forged paper, the genuine seals, the ledger copies together, they told a story of systematic fraud and human trafficking. "This evidence could bring Pike down," Mrs. Ellery said. "But getting it before Judge Harlan means risking everything. Pike won't hesitate to use violence to protect his schemes." Henry looked at Ruth, who was humming softly while organizing their papers. Her grandmother's hymn had brought them safely through the storm and guided them to the truth. Perhaps it could carry them through the final trial as well. "We've come this far," he said. "We can't stop now." Outside, the floodwaters were beginning to recede, revealing muddy roads that would soon be passable again. Pike would be moving soon, with men and weapons and the desperation of a cornered animal. But truth had its own power. And sometimes, When courage met justice at exactly the right moment, even the strongest walls of corruption could be brought down by the simple act of speaking what was real. The hymn continued, soft as prayer, strong as hope, carrying them toward whatever came next. The afternoon sun slanted through Mrs. Ellery's kitchen windows, casting golden squares on the evidence spread across her table. Henry studied the papers with growing certainty. Pike's pattern of fraud was clear, his forged seals obvious once you knew what to look for. But Ruth seemed distracted, her attention caught by something beyond their immediate discoveries. "Mr. Henry," she said quietly, "that red leather ledger, may I see it again?" Henry passed her the volume they had found in the courthouse. Ruth opened it carefully, running her finger down the columns of handwritten entries. "Here," she said, pointing to a page from 3 years earlier. "Look at this entry. Dinah and female child Ruth, transferred from estate of deceased M. Ashford. That's your mother's initial, isn't it?" Henry leaned closer, his heart beginning to race. "Yes, mother's name was Margaret. But I don't understand. Dinah and Ruth were never part of her estate. They belonged to my father's holdings. According to this, we were transferred after your mother died. But look at the signature line." Ruth pointed to a space that should have contained her grandmother's mark. Instead, it was blank, with a notation in different ink. "Mark refused. Subject claims manumission clause in MA. Effects. Mrs. Ellery looked up from her mending. Manumission clause? What would that mean? Henry felt memory stirring fragments of conversations he had overheard as a child, his mother speaking in low tones with visitors about arrangements and provisions for the future. "My mother was different from other plantation wives," he said slowly. "She corresponded with abolitionists in the North, contributed to charitable societies. Father always said she was too soft-hearted for her own good." "Soft-hearted enough to write freedom into her will?" Scylla asked from her place by the fire. Ruth had closed her eyes, her breathing falling into the measured rhythm Henry recognized from her hymn-singing. When she opened them again, there was new certainty in her gaze. "Grandmama Dinah used to talk about the promise in the binding," she said. "I thought she meant the binding of her word, her oath to keep working faithful. But what if she meant something else, something sewn into actual binding?" Henry felt understanding dawn like sunrise. "Your grandmother was a seamstress. She worked on my mother's personal things, quilts, clothing, household linens. And Mrs. Margaret always insisted on doing the final stitching herself," Scylla added, her voice growing excited. "Said some work was too important to trust to other hands." Ruth stood abruptly, moving to the window where the last light of afternoon filtered through. "Mr. Henry, is your mother's wedding quilt still in the house?" "In the attic. Father couldn't bear to see it after she died, but he wouldn't let it be given away either. We need to see that quilt. Tonight, before Pike comes back." Mrs. Ellery set down her mending. "Children, you're talking about breaking into a house that's probably being watched. Pike will have men stationed around the property." "Not everywhere," Ruth said with quiet confidence. "The hymn has a 4th verse, one I've never sung because it maps the most dangerous path of all, the route that leads back to where you started, but brings you there changed." She began to sing softly, her voice carrying a melody more complex than the earlier verses. "When the circle turns complete and the debt comes due, follow the underground stream to the root-deep door. 7 turns through the ancestors' ground, where promises sleep in thread and ink." Henry listened carefully, trying to decode the meaning. "Underground stream? There's no waterway that leads to our house." "Not water," Ruth said with a small smile. "The old drainage tunnel that runs from the bayou to the icehouse cellar. Your grandfather built it to keep provisions cool in summer." Henry stared at her. "How do you know about that?" "It's been sealed for years. Grandmama told me. Said she helped your grandfather's workers dig it out when she was young. The entrance is hidden under the big cypress, the one with the hollow trunk." Scylla nodded slowly. "I remember Dinah talking about that tunnel. Said it was a marvel of engineering, running near 200 yards through solid ground." Mrs. Ellery moved to her kitchen window, checking the approaches to her cabin. "Sun's getting low. If you're going to try this madness, now's the time. But I'm coming with you." "Mary, you can't," Scylla protested. "If you're caught helping fugitives." "I've been helping fugitives for 20 years," Mrs. Ellery replied calmly. Tonight won't be my first risk for the cause of justice. Besides, you'll need someone to keep watch while you search." They gathered their supplies as dusk painted the swamp in shades of purple and gold. Ruth led them by paths even more hidden than before, game trails that wound between standing water and fallen trees, routes that required them to crawl under branches and wade through knee-deep mud. The storm had left the countryside transformed. Familiar landmarks stood in new positions, shifted by wind and flood. But Ruth navigated with the certainty of someone following an internal compass, her humming providing steady rhythm for their careful progress. As full darkness fell, they reached the edge of the Ashford property. The main house stood distant across the fields, its windows glowing with lamplight. Between them and the building lay open ground that Pike's watchers would surely monitor. But Ruth led them in a wide circle, following the bayou's edge until they reached the massive cypress she had described. The tree was ancient beyond measure, its hollow trunk wide enough to shelter a horse and rider. "Here," she whispered, pushing aside curtains of moss to reveal a narrow opening at the tree's base. "The tunnel starts just inside." Henry peered into the darkness, smelling the musty scent of old earth and stagnant water. "Are you certain it's still passable?" Ruth had already disappeared into the hollow. Her voice echoed back, slightly muffled but clear. "Come on. Grandmama kept this way clear for 40 years. She wouldn't let it fail us now." The tunnel was exactly as Ruth had described, a marvel of engineering that ran straight as an arrow through the hard-pan clay. The walls were lined with cypress boards that had aged to the hardness of stone. The floor was paved with flat stones that provided firm footing despite the moisture. They moved in single file, Henry's lantern casting dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. The air was cool and heavy, carrying scents of earth and time, and the distant memory of tobacco smoke from some long-ago engineer's pipe. "Almost there," Ruth whispered from ahead. "I can smell the ice house sweet and cold, like winter saved in wood and stone." The tunnel ended at a wooden door set into fitted stones. Henry tested the latch carefully, feeling decades of rust flake away under his fingers. The door opened with a groan that seemed loud as thunder in the confined space. Beyond lay the ice house cellar, exactly as Henry remembered from childhood explorations: stone walls, wooden shelving, and a narrow stairway that led up to the main floor of the house. They emerged into the kitchen, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets that Mrs. Ashford had laid down to deaden sound. The house felt empty, though Henry knew his father was probably upstairs in his study, poring over account books and wondering where his son had disappeared to. "Attics this way," Henry whispered, leading them through familiar halls lined with family portraits. His mother's face looked down from several frames, her gentle expression seeming to approve of their midnight mission. The attic stairs creaked, despite their careful progress, but they reached the top without incident. Henry's lantern revealed a space crowded with the accumulation of generations, furniture, trunks, boxes of books and papers, and there in the far corner, a cedar chest that held his mother's most precious possessions. The wedding quilt lay folded with reverent care, its pattern still bright despite the years. Henry lifted it gently, feeling the weight of memory and love worked into every stitch. "Spread it here," Ruth instructed, indicating a clear space on the attic floor. "I need to see the whole pattern at once." The quilt unfolded into a masterwork of design and craftsmanship. Intricate blocks formed star patterns that seemed to dance in the lantern light. The border was a flowing vine design, worked in multiple shades of green and blue. But it was the binding that captured Ruth's attention, a narrow strip of brown cloth that edged the entire quilt with tiny, precise stitches. "There," she breathed, pointing to a section near one corner. "See how the stitching changes? These threads are different, heavier, set deeper. And the fabric underneath." Henry held the lantern closer as Ruth carefully lifted a small section of the binding. Beneath the brown cloth, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, lay a narrow strip of white paper. "Help me," Ruth whispered. "We need to open this section without damaging what's underneath." Working together, they carefully separated the binding from the quilt edge. The stitches had been set with expert skill, designed to hold fast for decades while still allowing access to someone who knew the secret. The paper strip emerged slowly, yellowed with age but still intact. Henry unfolded it with hands that trembled slightly, revealing careful writing in his mother's distinctive script. Last will and testament of Margaret Ashford, he read aloud. Special provisions not to be included in the public record. Ruth leaned closer, her breathing quick with anticipation. Henry continued reading. Item 7. Dinah and her female child Ruth, having served this family with devotion and skill, are hereby manumitted upon my death, to be given papers of freedom and transport to such place as they may choose, with provision of $50 silver for their establishment in free territory. The words hung in the attic air like a prayer finally spoken aloud. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. Grandmama told the truth. She always said Mrs. Margaret made a promise in the binding. Mrs. Ellery examined the document carefully. This appears to be legitimate, proper legal language, your mother's signature, even a witness mark here at the bottom. Henry studied the witness signature. Dr. Harrison. He was mother's physician during her final illness. I remember him being very fond of her, very respectful of her wishes. But why wasn't it filed with the county records? Scylla asked. Because, Henry realized with growing anger, Pike was already planning his schemes. If he could keep this provision secret, he could continue to claim ownership and eventually sell Ruth and Dinah for his own profit. Ruth had refolded the precious document with infinite care. Mr. Henry, this changes everything, if we can get this before Judge Harlan. We will, Henry said firmly. Tomorrow morning, we present all our evidence, the forged papers, the proof of Pike's fraud, and this manumission clause. Truth will out. But, as they carefully restored the quilt to its proper folds, sounds from below made them freeze. Heavy footsteps in the kitchen, men's voices, low and urgent. Pike, Henry breathed. He's here. Through the attic floorboards came muffled conversation, too indistinct to understand but clearly threatening in tone. They had been discovered, and escape through the tunnel might no longer be possible. Ruth began humming again, so quietly it was barely audible. The fourth verse of her grandmother's hymn, the one that mapped the way home through danger and darkness. 7 turns through the ancestors' ground, she sang under her breath, where promises sleep in thread and ink. Henry understood. They had found the promise in the binding, retrieved it from its hiding place in thread and ink. Now they needed the 7 turns that would carry them safely away from the danger gathering in the house below. But as Pike's voice grew louder and footsteps began climbing toward their hiding place, Henry wondered if they had finally reached the point where even Ruth's grandmother's wisdom might not be enough to save them. The document in Ruth's hands represented freedom and justice. The question was whether they would live long enough to present it to the world. The footsteps paused at the bottom of the attic stairs. Pike's voice carried clearly through the floorboards, harsh with frustrated anger. Tear this place apart if you have to. Boy's got to be hiding somewhere, and he's got that girl with him. Find anything that looks like papers or documents. Henry pressed himself against the attic wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. Beside him, Ruth remained perfectly still, the precious manumission clause tucked safely inside her dress. Mrs. Ellery and Scylla crouched near the cedar chest, barely breathing. The footsteps resumed their climb. Pike was coming up, bringing at least 2 men with him. They would be armed and desperate, knowing that their fraudulent schemes were on the verge of exposure. Ruth caught Henry's eye and gestured toward the far end of the attic, where a small window faced the backyard. But escape that way meant a 20-foot drop to hard ground, possible survival, but certain injury. The attic door creaked open. Pike's lantern light swept across the cluttered space, creating wild shadows among the stored furniture and boxes. "I know you're up here, boy," Pike called out. "Found the tunnel entrance at the cypress tree. Clever, but not clever enough. Time to come out and face what you've done." Henry remained motionless, knowing that any sound would betray their position. The attic was large and crowded. With decades of accumulation, they might stay hidden if Pike's search remained cursory. But Pike was methodical in his hunting. He moved slowly through the space, checking behind every trunk and beneath every piece of stored furniture. His men followed, their heavy boots making the old floor creak ominously. "Found something here?" One of the men called from near the window. "Footprints in the dust. Fresh ones." Pike's lantern swung toward their hiding place. In moments, he would discover them crouched behind the cedar chest, and their mission would end in capture, or worse. That was when Ruth began to sing. Not humming this time, but singing aloud in her clear, pure voice. The fourth verse of her grandmother's hymn, the one she had called most dangerous. When the circle turns complete and the debt comes due, follow the underground stream to the root-deep door. 7 turns through the ancestors' ground, where promises sleep in thread and ink. The melody rose through the attic like smoke, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Pike's men stopped moving, confused by the ethereal sound that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "What in hell?" Pike muttered, swinging his lantern in wide arcs. But Ruth continued singing, her voice growing stronger with each repetition. And then, impossibly, other voices joined her. From somewhere else in the house came the sound of people humming the same melody, house servants who recognized the tune, who understood its meaning as a call for help. The humming spread like ripples in still water. From the kitchen below, from the servant quarters, from the stables beyond, voices rose in wordless harmony. The entire household was responding to Ruth's signal, creating a wall of sound that made it impossible to locate any single source. Pike cursed and gestured to his men. "Find where that's coming from. Tear this place apart." But the humming had accomplished its purpose. In the confusion of searching for its source, Pike and his men had moved away from the cedar chest. A narrow path to the attic stairs stood momentarily clear. Henry caught Ruth's eye and nodded. They would have one chance to reach the stairway before Pike reorganized his search. One opportunity to get the manumission clause to safety. Ruth ended her song with a final sustained note that seemed to hang in the air like a benediction. Then she moved, flowing across the attic floor like water, silent as mist. Henry followed, with Mrs. Ellery and Scylla close behind. They reached the stairs just as Pike realized his mistake. There, by the door. But Ruth was already descending, her feet barely touching the wooden steps. The humming from throughout the house grew louder, providing cover for their escape and confusion for their pursuers. They burst into the hallway as Pike's heavy boots thundered down the attic stairs. The house felt alive around them, filled with voices raised in protective harmony. Servants appeared in doorways, not to block their escape but to add their voices to the growing chorus. "The tunnel," Henry gasped, "back to the ice house." But as they rounded the corner toward the kitchen, more of Pike's men appeared at the front door, weapons drawn and faces grim. The house was surrounded. Ruth never hesitated. She led them not toward the ice house but deeper into the house, toward Henry's father's study, where lamplight still glowed beneath the door. "Mr. Henry," she called out as they approached, "your father needs to see what we found." She threw open the study door without ceremony, revealing Henry's father hunched over his account books. The older man looked up in surprise, taking in their muddy clothes and desperate expressions. "Son, what in God's name?" "Father," Henry said, breathing hard from their flight, "Pike's been forging sale documents. He's been stealing our people and selling them downriver, pocketing the profits." Ruth stepped forward and withdrew the manumission clause from her dress, and this was hidden in Mrs. Margaret's wedding quilt. "She freed me and Grandmama in her will, but Pike kept it secret so he could sell us." Henry's father took the document with shaking hands, studying his deceased wife's handwriting by lamplight. "Margaret always said she had made provisions. I never knew what she meant." Pike burst into the study with his armed men behind him. "Mr. Ashford, sir, these fugitives have been spreading lies about legal business. I have proper papers for all sales conducted." "Do you?" Henry's father asked mildly, still holding the manumission clause. "Because this document suggests my wife freed these people 3 years ago, which would make any subsequent sale an act of theft." Pike's face went white. That paper's a forgery. Anyone could have written, 'In my deceased wife's hand?'" The older man's voice carried a new edge of steel. "Using her personal seal and witnessed by Dr. Harrison?" "I think not." Ruth began humming again, softly now, the melody that had guided them through every danger. Around the house, other voices continued their supportive chorus, creating an atmosphere of protection and truth. Henry pulled out the courthouse records they had copied, spreading them on his father's desk. "Pike's been using false seals, father. Look at these entries. He sold 30 people in 6 months, reported half the amounts, kept the difference for himself. The evidence was overwhelming when seen together. Forged documents with incorrect seals, falsified ledger entries, and now the hidden manumission clause that proved Pike's most recent attempted sale was completely illegal." Henry's father stood slowly, his face grave with new understanding. "Mr. Pike, I believe we need to have a conversation with Judge Harlan. In the morning, with all interested parties present." Pike's hand moved toward the pistol at his belt, but the study was crowded now with house servants drawn by the commotion. Their humming had stopped, but their presence filled the room with quiet strength. "Don't make this worse," Henry's father continued. "You're already facing charges of fraud and theft. Adding violence won't improve your situation." For a long moment, Pike stood poised between fight and surrender. Then his shoulders sagged, and the fight went out of him like air from a punctured bladder. "Judge Harlan, then," he muttered, "but this ain't over. Too many important people got interests in keeping things the way they are." "Perhaps," Henry's father replied, "but my wife's will is clear, and Dr. Harrison is still alive to testify to her wishes. Some truths can't be buried forever." As Pike and his men were escorted from the house under guard, Ruth moved to the window where the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the sky. Her humming resumed, softer now, carrying notes of hope rather than warning. "The circle turns complete," she sang quietly, "and the debt comes due." Henry understood. They had followed her grandmother's hymn through danger and darkness, following underground streams and hidden doors, making 7 turns through ancestors' ground to find the promise that slept in thread and ink. The debt was indeed coming due: Pike's debt to justice, the plantation's debt to truth, and perhaps the whole system's debt to the people it had treated as property instead of persons. Outside, the dawn chorus of birds began, joining their voices to Ruth's ancient melody. The long night was ending, and with the morning light would come the final reckoning. But they had the evidence they needed. The truth was documented, witnessed, and ready to be presented in open court. The dance of mercy was approaching its culmination. Judge Harlan's courthouse stood solid against the morning sky, its brick walls still dark with yesterday's rain, but its windows bright with promise. By 8 o'clock, word had spread through the county like ripples in still water. There would be a reading of papers, a settling of accounts, a public resolution to matters that had been whispered about in private for too long. Henry stood on the courthouse steps, the precious documents secure in a leather portfolio under his arm. Beside him, Ruth wore a clean dress, not the patched blue calico, which had been carefully folded and placed in the cedar chest with his mother's quilt, but a simple grey frock that Aunt Scylla had produced from her own belongings. "You nervous?" Ruth asked softly, her voice carrying the calm that came from knowing the truth was finally ready to be spoken. Henry nodded, terrified, but also free. "Does that make sense?" Ruth smiled, the expression transforming her young face with unexpected beauty. "Yes. Grandmama used to say, truth has weight when you carry it secret, but turns light as air when you set it loose." Around them, the courthouse square filled with curious townspeople. News of Pike's arrest had traveled fast, bringing merchants and farmers, house servants and free laborers, anyone whose life had been touched by the overseer's schemes. "Doctor?" Harrison approached through the crowd, his medical bag in one hand and a leather folder in the other. His hair had gone completely white in the years since Henry's mother's death, but his eyes remained sharp with intelligence and moral purpose. "Mr. Henry," he said, offering a firm handshake, "I've brought my own copy of your mother's provisions, kept it all these years, waiting for the day when it might be needed." "You knew about the manumission clause?" Dr. Harrison nodded gravely. "Your mother asked me to witness it, because she feared it might be overlooked after her death. She was a wise woman who understood the hearts of men better than they understood themselves." Clerk Dupré emerged from the courthouse, carrying a wooden box filled with official seals and legal documents. He moved with the careful precision of a man whose work had been questioned and who was determined to prove his honesty. "Mr. Ashford," he called out, "I've brought every seal impression I've made in the past year, along with samples of my genuine wax. If there's been forgery using my marks, we'll expose it today." Mrs. Ellery arrived in her simple Quaker dress, accompanied by several neighbors who had traveled from the countryside to witness the proceedings. They represented the quiet network of people who believed in justice even when it came at personal cost. At 9 o'clock sharp, Judge Harlan appeared on the courthouse steps. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of presence that made crowds fall silent without effort. His reputation for fairness was known throughout the county, though he had never been tested on matters involving the peculiar institution of slavery. "Citizens," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the square, "we're gathered this morning to examine certain documents and allegations. This is a court of law, not a place of entertainment. I expect proper decorum from all present." Pike was escorted up the steps in iron shackles, his usual swagger replaced by the hunched posture of a man who knew his schemes had been exposed. His eyes darted nervously over the assembled crowd, no doubt calculating which faces belonged to allies and which to enemies. "Mr. Pike," Judge Harlan continued, "you stand accused of forgery, theft, and the fraudulent sale of people you did not legally own. How do you answer these charges?" Pike's voice came out as a croak. "I was conducting legal business according to proper documentation." "We shall examine that documentation presently." The judge turned to Henry. "Mr. Ashford, I understand you have evidence to present to this court?" Henry stepped forward, opening his portfolio to reveal the carefully organized papers. "Yes, Your Honor, evidence of forged seals, falsified ledger entries, and most importantly, a manumission clause that was deliberately concealed." Judge Harlan gestured toward a table that had been set up on the courthouse steps. The morning sun slanted across its surface, providing perfect light for examining documents. First came the forged bill of sale that Pike had used to justify Ruth's removal. Clerk Dupré compared it carefully to his own genuine seals, pointing out the differences in wax color, letter form, and impression depth. "This is not my work," Dupré stated clearly. "The seal is a crude copy. The wax is the wrong grade, and the letter forms show backward serifs. Whoever made this impression had never seen my genuine technique." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Pike's face had gone pale as parchment. Next came the courthouse ledger copies, documenting Pike's pattern of illegal sales over the past 6 months. Judge Harlan studied the entries with growing seriousness, cross-referencing them with official property records. "These sales were never properly recorded with the county," he observed. "No transfer fees were paid, no ownership changes were filed. Mr. Pike, can you explain this discrepancy?" Pike's lawyer, a nervous man who had clearly been hired hastily, mumbled something about administrative delays and unusual circumstances. But it was the manumission clause that brought true silence to the courthouse square. Judge Harlan unfolded the yellow document with reverent care, reading Margaret Ashford's final wishes aloud in a voice that carried to every corner of the gathering. Item 7. Dinah and her female child Ruth, having served this family with devotion and skill, are hereby manumitted upon my death, to be given papers of freedom and transport to such place as they may choose, with provision of $50 silver for their establishment in free territory. Dr. Harrison stepped forward to verify the signature and his own witness mark. His testimony was clear and unshakable. Mrs. Ashford had indeed written these provisions with her own hand, in his presence, with full knowledge of their legal implications. "This document predates all of Mr. Pike's alleged sales by 3 years, Judge Harlan observed. "If authentic, it would make any subsequent sale not merely fraudulent, but an act of kidnapping under state law." Pike's lawyer made a desperate attempt to challenge the document's authenticity, but his arguments crumbled under the weight of evidence. The paper, the ink, the handwriting, the witness, all were genuine beyond reasonable doubt. Ruth had been listening to the proceedings with quiet dignity, but now Judge Harlan addressed her directly. "Miss Ruth, do you understand what this document means?" "Yes, sir," she replied clearly. "It means I've been free for 3 years, me and my mother both. We just didn't know it. And what would you choose to do with that freedom?" Ruth looked around the courthouse square, her gaze taking in the faces of townspeople who had gathered to witness this moment. Some showed sympathy, others skepticism, but all were listening. "I'd like to stay here," she said simply. "This is home. These are my people. I'd like to help Aunt Scylla with her healing work, maybe learn to read and write proper, and I'd like to keep singing the old songs so they don't get forgotten." Her words carried across the square like a prayer, touching something deep in the hearts of people who had thought they understood what freedom meant. Judge Harlan nodded gravely. "So be it." He turned to Pike. "Mr. Pike, I find you guilty of forgery, theft, and attempted kidnapping. You will be held for trial in the district court, and all property obtained through fraudulent means will be restored to its rightful owners or recipients." Pike's legs seemed to give way beneath him. The guards caught his arms as he sagged, the reality of his situation finally breaking through his desperate denials. But the proceedings were not finished. Henry stepped forward one more time, his voice carrying new strength. "Your Honor, if I may, there's one more matter to address." Judge Harlan gestured for him to continue. Henry looked out over the assembled crowd, then turned to Ruth with a gesture that recalled their dance from the night of his engagement party. 3 nights ago, this young woman was mocked and ridiculed for wearing a patched dress to a social gathering. Tonight, we know that her dignity under that treatment showed more nobility than all the silk and satin in Louisiana. He paused, gathering his thoughts and his courage. "I would like to ask Miss Ruth for the honor of another dance. Not because I claim any authority over her, but because I want this community to see her as I do as a person worthy of respect, kindness, and justice." Ruth smiled, understanding flowing between them like recognition of an old song suddenly remembered. "Yes, Mr. Henry," she said clearly. "I would be honored to dance with you again." Someone in the crowd began humming Ruth's grandmother's hymn, the melody that had guided them through every trial and danger. Other voices joined in, creating a chorus that rose from the courthouse steps like incense. Henry offered his arm to Ruth, and she took it with quiet dignity. They began to move together in the morning sunlight, not the formal steps of a ballroom waltz, but something simpler and more profound. Two people, acknowledging each other's humanity in a public space where such acknowledgement had been forbidden. The crowd made room for them, forming a circle on the courthouse steps. Judge Harlan watched with interest, Clerk Dupré nodded approval, and Dr. Harrison's eyes filled with tears as he remembered the gentlewoman who would have rejoiced to see this moment. As they danced, Ruth began to sing the words to her grandmother's hymn, her voice rising clear and strong. "When the circle turns complete and the debt comes due, follow the underground stream to the root-deep door. 7 turns through the ancestors' ground, where promises sleep in thread and ink." The song had brought them through every trial, from the kitchen at daybreak to the storm-tossed swamp, from the hidden tunnel to the courthouse steps. Now it carried them into a future that neither could have imagined just days before. The dance ended, but the singing continued. Voice after voice joined the hymn, creating a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself, carrying stories of pain and hope, loss and redemption, justice delayed but not denied. Judge Harlan raised his gavel, bringing the official proceedings to a close. "Let the record show that justice has been served this day, and that freedom once denied has been rightfully restored." But the real conclusion came as the crowd slowly dispersed, people approaching Ruth and Henry to offer congratulations, to ask questions about the hymn's meaning, to express wonder at a story that had transformed from private scandal to public redemption. As the last of the townspeople departed, Ruth and Henry stood together on the courthouse steps, watching the sun climb higher in a clear blue sky. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and full of possibility. "What comes next?" Ruth asked softly. Henry thought of his broken engagement, his father's changed understanding, the plantation that would need to operate by new rules and principles. "Work," he said finally. "The good kind of work, building something better than what came before." Ruth nodded, humming softly as the courthouse bell began to chime the hour. The notes rang clear and true across the square, marking not just the passage of time but the beginning of something new. The dance of mercy was complete. The circle had turned full, the debt had been paid, and the promise hidden in thread and ink had finally been honored in the full light of day. Behind them, the courthouse doors stood open, ready to serve justice to anyone brave enough to seek it. Above them, the morning sky stretched wide with hope, carrying the echo of an ancient hymn toward horizons yet to be explored. The story was ending, but the song would continue, passed from voice to voice, generation to generation, a map of courage written in melody and memory for all who needed to find their way home. Asterisk, asterisk, epilogue, evening light, asterisk, asterisk. 3 months later, as summer twilight painted the bayou in shades of gold and purple, Ruth sat on the porch of the small cabin that Henry had built for her and her mother behind the main house. The structure was simple but solid, with wide windows that caught the breeze and a garden plot where medicinal herbs grew in neat, fragrant rows. She was teaching the hymn to Mary Catherine, Mrs. Ellery's young niece, who had come to visit for the harvest season. The child's high, sweet voice blended with Ruth's deeper tones, creating harmonies that seemed to hang in the evening air like visible music. "And that's how you remember the way to the safe houses?" Mary Catherine asked, when they finished the third verse. "That's how," Ruth confirmed, adjusting the strings of her new guitar, a gift from Henry, crafted by a German instrument maker in New Orleans. "But remember, it's not just the words you sing. It's the feeling you put behind them. Songs like this only work when they carry real faith." From the main house came the sound of voices, Henry and his father discussing plans for the cotton harvest, which this year would be brought in by workers paid fair wages rather than enslaved labor. The transition had been difficult, expensive, and sometimes contentious, but the work was getting done with better spirit than before. Ruth's mother, Dinah, emerged from their cabin, carrying a tray of mint tea and molasses cookies. At 53, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had worked hard all her life, but now carried herself with the dignity of a free woman. "Mr. Henry's been asking about the Sunday school plans," she told Ruth. "Says he's found some good books for teaching letters and numbers." Ruth nodded, continuing to tune her guitar. The Sunday school had been her idea, a way to share reading and writing skills with anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of color or station. It met in the old carriage house, with lessons adapted to different ages and abilities. "Mrs. Lucille came by today, too," Dinah continued, settling into her rocking chair with a satisfied sigh. Ruth looked up in surprise. "Lucille Valaton? Here? Former Miss Valaton," Dinah corrected with a small smile. "She married that banker's son from Natchez. Wanted to apologize for her behavior at the engagement party. What did you tell her?" "Told her apologies are fine, but actions matter more. Invited her to attend Sunday school if she wants to learn something useful." Mary Catherine giggled at the idea of a fine lady like Lucille sitting in the carriage house, learning her letters alongside former slaves and poor white children. The evening deepened around them, filled with the comfortable sounds of a household settling into rest. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird ran through its repertoire of borrowed songs, adding its voice to the symphony of night sounds from the bayou. Henry appeared on the main house porch, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hair tousled from the day's work. He had grown leaner over the summer, his face tanned from working alongside the field hands rather than merely supervising them. "Ruth," he called across the yard, "could I trouble you for a song? Father's been asking to hear that hymn again." Ruth rose with her guitar, followed by Mary Catherine and Dinah. They crossed the yard as fireflies began to dance among the jasmine bushes, their light joining the soft glow from the house windows. On the main house porch, Henry's father sat in his favorite chair, looking older but somehow more at peace than he had in the months following his wife's death. Dr. Harrison was visiting, his medical bag resting beside his chair as he sipped bourbon and shared stories of patients helped and lives saved. "Evening, Miss Ruth," the elder Mr. Ashford said warmly. "Beautiful night for music." Ruth settled onto the porch steps, her fingers finding familiar chords on the guitar strings. The hymn began softly, building as other voices joined in Henry's uncertain but enthusiastic tenor, Dinah's rich alto, Mary Catherine's silvery soprano, and even Dr. Harrison's rusty bass. Jordan's banks, Jordan's bends, follow the star through the cypress knees. 3 poles mark the turning place, where the safe door opens east. The melody carried across the bayou, mixing with night sounds and distant laughter from the quarters where families gathered after their day's work. It was the same song Ruth's grandmother had sung, but somehow it sounded different now, less like a map to hidden roots and more like a celebration of journeys completed. As the final verse faded, comfortable silence settled over the porch. The adults sat thinking their own thoughts while Mary Catherine counted fireflies in the garden. "Ruth," Henry said quietly, "I've been meaning to ask, do you ever think about leaving? Going north where you could have? More opportunities?" Ruth strummed a gentle chord, considering her answer. "I think about it sometimes. Wonder what it would be like to walk down a street where nobody thinks twice about the color of my skin." She paused, listening to night sounds that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "But then I remember that running to freedom isn't the same as building it where you are. This place has my roots in it. Grandmama's buried in the cemetery hill, my mother's garden is finally growing the way she always dreamed. And there's work here that needs doing. Teaching the children? Teaching Healing, remembering. Making sure the old songs don't get lost and the new ones get sung right. Ruth smiled in the darkness. Besides, somebody's got to keep you honest, Mr. Henry. Make sure all these good intentions turn into lasting change. Henry laughed, the sound warm and genuine. I'd like to think we're making progress. Father's already talking about dividing some land for sharecropping, giving families a chance to build something of their own. It's a start, Ruth agreed. Change comes slow, but it comes, especially when folks keep singing it into existence. The evening stretched toward full night, with conversations continuing in comfortable murmurs. Plans for the harvest, stories of patients helped by Dinah's herbal remedies, dreams of schools and libraries, and communities where worth was measured by character rather than color. As the gathering finally began to disperse, Ruth packed away her guitar and prepared to return to her cabin, but Henry caught her arm gently, his expression serious in the lamplight. "Ruth," he said quietly, "I want you to know what happened that night at the engagement party, when I asked you to dance. That wasn't charity or pity. It was recognition. Of something I'd been blind to for too long." Ruth nodded, understanding passing between them like recognition of an old song suddenly remembered. "I know, Mr. Henry. And what I gave you when I said yes, that wasn't gratitude or duty. It was trust. Trust that you might become the man your mother raised you to be." They stood for a moment in comfortable silence, two people who had found their way through storm and darkness to something approaching peace. "Thank you," Henry said finally, "for the dance, for the trust, for showing me a different way to see the world." "Thank you," Ruth replied, "for choosing to see it." She walked back to her cabin under a sky bright with stars, humming softly as fireflies lit her path. Behind her, the main house settled into rest, its windows glowing warm against the darkness. In her cabin, Dinah was already asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful in a way it had never been during the years of uncertainty and fear. Ruth moved quietly, preparing for her own rest while the night sounds of the bayou provided their familiar lullaby. Tomorrow would bring new work herbs to gather, children to teach, songs to share. The Sunday school was growing, drawing students from across the county who hungered for knowledge and opportunity. There were letters to write to abolitionists in the North, sharing their story of change accomplished through courage and persistence rather than violence or flight. But tonight, as she settled into her own bed in her own home on land where she belonged by right rather than sufferance, Ruth thought of her grandmother's words about promises hidden in thread and ink, about maps written in melody, about the long journey from bondage to freedom that required not just legal documents, but transformation of hearts. The circle had turned complete, the debt had been paid, and the song that began in a plantation kitchen at daybreak had become a hymn of hope carried on evening air toward horizons, bright with possibility. Outside her window, the bayou murmured its ancient secrets to the listening night. Inside, Ruth fell asleep to the sound of her own humming, dreaming of children learning to read, of gardens growing free from fear, of dances shared in the full light of justice where once there had been only mockery and shame. The story was ending, but the song would continue, passed from voice to voice, heart to heart, generation to generation, carrying maps to freedom for all who had the courage to follow them home.